Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Northern California, I welcome you to this evening's program, Cuba Paradox Island. We are pleased and honored to have with us Cynthia Gorney, contributing writer for National Geographic magazine. My name is Jerome Nelson, and I am a program officer here at the World Affairs Council. The World Affairs Council offers a neutral forum on critical international issues and opportunities. To learn more about the Council, hear its programs, or join its membership, please visit our website at worldaffairs.org. Tonight's program is being recorded for radio, and we thank our audio engineer, Ms. Jane Heaven. Now, if you will, please take a moment to turn off all those cell phones and any other noise-making devices. As well, please make use of the blue question cards that have been placed on your seats. Council staff will collect them and share them with our moderator during the second half of our program. Folks, tonight's event is a precursor to a more in-depth conversation that will be held during our annual conference, World Affairs 2013, Transition, Disruption, and Innovation. On Thursday, March 7 and Friday, March 8th, the Council will host this conference at the St. Regis of San Francisco. One of the panel discussions will focus on leftist governments throughout Latin America, including Cuba, and will feature 4 experts to give their insights on the region. Registration is now open, so please visit our website to register. I would now like to introduce tonight's moderator. Carla Thorson is the Vice President of Programs here at the World Affairs Council. Prior to joining the Council, she was on the faculty at UCLA and the UCLA International Institute's Center for European and Eurasian Studies. Dr. Thorson earned her MA and PhD in political science at the University of California, Los Angeles. With special interest in Russian politics and European affairs, she also holds an MLit in modern Russian history from the University of Oxford and a BA in history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Thorson, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Jerome. And now, on behalf of the World Affairs Council, I am Carla Thorson, Vice President of Programs here at the World Affairs Council, and your moderator for this evening. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. Cynthia Gorney is a former Washington Post reporter who served as the paper's South American bureau chief during the early 1980s. She's now a contributing writer for National Geographic magazine, where she often reports on Latin America. She's written for many national magazines, including the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, Harper's, and Sports Illustrated. And Ms. Gorney is currently on the faculty at the University of California, Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. Here tonight to speak with us about a piece that she wrote for National Geographic that appeared in the November issue based on several trips to Cuba over the past year. We're delighted to have Cynthia here this evening to speak with us. Please join me in welcoming her.
I'm happy just to stay here if we want to move that back so I can see everybody over there. I'll just stay seated. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm a great admirer of the World Affairs Council, and it's a pleasure to be able to come here and talk about Cuba. I feel that I should tell you, I'm just curious in this audience, how many of you have actually been to Cuba? Oh, a fair number. I love the Bay Area. There's no other place in the country where almost 2/3 of the people in the audience would raise their hands about having been to Cuba. And many of you, I'm sure, joined me in merrily violating State Department regulation and going there. Oh, no, everybody's furiously shaking their heads. Some people are nodding. Some people are shaking their heads. Let me tell you a little bit about how this began, because it's pertinent to the nature of the conversations I had in Cuba. And I have one other question, which there'll be a reason for my asking this. How many of the people in the audience have had a chance to read the story in National Geographic? Okay, a few, but not everybody. Okay, the ones who haven't read it, something's going to happen later on that'll probably annoy you, but there's nothing I can do about it, which is that I'm not going to tell you how the story came out. But what happened, one of the things, I've worked for the National Geographic for about 7 years now. It's a reporter's dream in many ways as a place to work, because they are one of the last great institutions in the world that really throws resources into reporting. They have enormous confidence in their writers, as well as obviously their photographers, who are some of the very best in the world. And their idea of an assignment, at least in my experience with them, is almost always like this one. And my assignment was as follows: Cuba, go. That was it. That was the whole assignment. And they don't give me direction. They definitely did not give me direction on this one. For those like me, not for my tenure there, but from before my tenure there 7 years ago, I had a notion, incorrect in the present iteration at any rate, of the National Geographic as a fairly conservative, politically kind of magazine. And I worried just a tad before going that this would be the piece where if I saw things that bumped up against their notion of what Cuba ought to look like, there would be some editorial trouble. I could not have been wronger. They gave me complete liberty, and really, that was the assignment. When we talked about why, there were a couple of things underway that made them very interested in Cuba at this particular juncture, but they were very broad scale. For those of you who have been following Cuba at all, and particularly the many in the audience who have been there, you know that, for example, 4 years ago, Fidel Castro finally formally handed over the presidency to his younger, although not very young, he's in his early 80s, brother, Raul, and that in the last 2 years, the government has been making what on paper are some fairly substantial changes to the regulatory system of what Cubans always refer to as the Proyecto Socialista, which is the socialist project, which is still how the government of Cuba is referred to in most places. You don't hear the word communism used very much in Cuba, although the central party is still the Communist Party of Cuba, but which you will hear a lot, the Proyecto Socialista, and everything is in the context of that. The changes that are underway, again, as those of you who have visited know, include what look like some relatively substantial alterations to a government that for over 4 decades now has been run solely by the government and for the government. 181 categories of legal self-employment in which individual workers are allowed to run their own businesses in ways that were illegal under the fully socialist days. These people are called cuentapropistas, which literally translates to keepers of their own accounts. That's really what they're meant to do. All of a sudden now, not all of a sudden anymore, as of some months back, it was legal to buy and sell private property, which was considered an enormous concession to entrepreneurial capitalism, because one of the great self-proclaimed advances of the revolution was that where people lived, people's housing, was no longer subject to the vagaries of the capitalist market, and it was legal previously to do an exchange, a house exchange, but you could not buy and sell property. Now, Cubans are wildly entrepreneurial by their nature and by their long history, so of course every one of these house exchanges was accompanied by an enormous transfer of cash under the table, but it wasn't legal to do that. In theory and on paper, it was an exchange. That's gone. You can buy and sell cars now. You can take out bank loans. There are a few other changes that came on paper that were considered a very big deal in Cuba, a certain opening of discussion of these things. And so my mission was just to go down and see what it was like. There's a reason I'm going to tell you a tiny bit about my family background, because it sort of affects the way that, in some ways, I was the best possible pair of ears and eyes to go down to Cuba, because I was, number one, pretty ignorant. I've done a lot of reporting in Latin America, but had never been to Cuba. When I was working for the Washington Post, my jurisdiction ended at Venezuela. I was all over South America. And I've been in Mexico quite a bit as a reporter, but I had never gone there. I had what I would say is a fairly typical Northern California person's ignorance of Cuba, which is to say you see Cuba romanticized a great deal in the politics of this region. We do not live in Florida, where Cuban is demonized on the radio every single day. But I only knew a couple of Cubans as good friends, and we didn't spend much time talking about it. My own background, my father is a Mexican immigrant who came here when he was relatively young in college, and like many immigrants, leaned throughout most of his adult life to the conservative politically. So when I was at the hippie rebellious age, when other people's parents were calling them hippie communists, my father was railing at me for being a Fidelista. So there's one side. My mother, on the other hand, was a good North Beach, San Francisco bohemian who fundamentally didn't believe in materialism at all. And when she got disgusted with what she regarded as decadence in values, her standard line when I was growing up was, "Send them to the cane fields," which was a reference to the great political effort of the 1970 harvest in Cuba. It failed, but it was a major international effort in which everybody who believed in the revolution went down there or tried to go down there to help with the harvest. So we had a little bit of dueling politics. Both narratives of Cuba, on some level, had been implanted into my teenage brain as I was growing up. And that's relevant because if you're a fairly ignorant person heading into Cuba without a pre-planned agenda and you go hit the reading shelves, you find these dueling voices shouting at you from almost every piece of literature that you pick up. As a reporter, my one real area of considerable expertise, a subject on which I spent many years and working on a big book, is abortion in the United States. And the reason I mention that is that never before have I encountered a subject that was so like thinking and writing about abortion, in the sense that every conversation you have about Cuba is held in one vocabulary or another depending on what people's base principles are, depending on whether people think what originally occurred there was a righteous revolutionary overthrowing a corrupt dictatorship and oppressive imperialist businesses, or a ruthless revolutionary imposing a totalitarian state and getting rid of his own entrepreneurial classes to create a one-party system in which no one was allowed to speak or think freely. And everything seemed to flow from that. So, with all that said, I land in Cuba. And I made 3 visits there. Each time I tried the second 2 times to get, actually it wasn't until the 3rd time that I formally tried to get a press visa. And what happened to me was what I had been told by my reporter friends happens to most reporters who attempt to get a press visa in Cuba, unless they are explicitly making a heroic film about the Castros or something. People were very polite. "This is very interesting. We're so interested in your project. We'll certainly take this into consideration." Nothing. Silence, you know. "How about that visa?" "Oh yeah, we'll get right back to you." Silence. So you get put in a drawer somewhere, and then presumably there's a committee somewhere in either Havana or Washington, it's not clear, that's arguing about you, and you never hear from them again. And since so many of my friends had told me this, I went there the first time and then again the second and third times on tourist status, doing the thing where you go to Mexico and you have it set up in advance, and somebody says, "Look for Ramon because he'll bring you your ticket and you'll pay your $25 fee for your health insurance to Ramon, and then you'll get a ticket on Cubana Air and you'll land in Jose Marti Airport and you'll find your way around." Being, a Spanish-speaking person who wanders around a lot, I'm reasonably good at finding my way around. And my normal mode of travel when I'm doing stories like this, as I like to tell people, is to do as much reading in advance as I can and then stumble around assuming people will be nice to me if I'm nice to them. This worked fantastically well in Cuba, to my astonishment. No one was afraid to talk to me about anything as long as we were in a private place with doors closed. The first time I was very tentative, and I would say, in all honesty, I'm a university professor, which I am. I'm also a writer, which I am. I also write for National Geographic sometimes, which I do, and they are interested in Cuba. That's all I would say. I would not say I'm here with my notebook on assignment. After we talked for a while, I would say, "Is it okay if I pull out a notebook?" And people would say yes if we weren't in a public place. But I discovered that getting people to talk about what was irritating them about Cuba, what they loved, and much more commonly what they wanted to complain about, an interview with a Cuban in this regard goes like this. "So, Cuban talks really fast with tremendous emotion, and it's an excellent education system. It really is. So it's going to be a very articulate, very passionate conversation, and it goes on for an hour. And then there's a pause, and you say, and then what?" And they talk for another hour. That's doing a Cuban interview. I've never worked in a place that was so exhilarating as a reporter, because you're working with people who are very well educated, have a really big thing happening in front of them, are very passionate and warm and talkative by their nature. I hate national generalizations of this sort, but in Cuba it really is true. Cubans are very, I know we're on radio, so the radio people can't see this, but if you talk to a Cuban, they'll be putting their arm on you. I'm leaning over a radio audience. They'll be putting their arm on you and leaning forward, and it's men and women alike. It's not a sexy advance. It's just that this is how people relate. They get close. They get up in your face. They want to talk about stuff. And driving around in cars, which you can do very readily when you're in an island that has a terrible airplane infrastructure, which Cuba does, for long periods of time, is an excellent way to get to know Cubans if you're a Spanish speaker, because they're away from anybody who could possibly eavesdrop, and they will talk. So what happened to me on one of my early visits, as I began hearing the litanies of complaints that were coming from Cubans who would say over and over to me, look, I love this country. I don't really want to bail out the way my uncle Jose and Ramon and so on have already gone to Miami and other countries. I want to stay here. I want to make this place work, but they're not letting me. And by them, typically from almost any Cuban, it was, and again, I know it's radio, the tap on the shoulder. This is the signal in Cuba for what several Cubans referred to me as the peso gordo, which is the fat fish, the big fish. And a big fish, the reason you're tapping your shoulder is because that's where your military hardware is displayed. So anybody who's caught up in the bureaucracy up at the top level is presumed to be making good money, some of it legal, much of it not, or quasi-legal, and working fine off the system. Everybody else, I was hearing, is really screwed by a number of different forces, including this insane system that they have right now that involves two separate currencies, one of which is available to foreigners, the other of which is made for Cubans, called the peso nacional, and is worth 1/24th of the currency that is primarily in the hands of foreigners and those with foreign contact. Okay? So I'm gonna wind up pretty soon because I know we have a lot of questions, but what happens is I start hearing this litany of complaints over and over and over again from people who say the system doesn't let anybody work and earn the money that they're worth. The government jobs pay us nothing. They pay us in pesos nacionales. It doesn't matter how hard you work. It doesn't matter whether you're a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. You get paid in this worthless currency. It's not wholly worthless. You can buy certain subsidized foods with it. You get a free education. You get free health care, absolutely. You get certain kinds of things to eat. You can buy your newspapers free. You can buy your books free. If you want any of the things that, I'm sorry, Ghost of Che Guevara, people in 2012 want, nice shoes, alcohol, acid wash blue jeans, entry into the discotheque, a toy for your kid, a thing that goes vroom vroom, a sandwich that is not just 2 pieces of sliced ham and cheese on a piece of bread, that will be sold to you in money that you cannot afford if you are doing your government job. So this is infuriating to Cubans. And they talk eloquently and at great length about it, and about the fact that the most educated of them and the most dedicated, the doctors, the lawyers, the professionals who stayed, can't afford to do these basic things. So I'm out in a car, one of my long car drives, with a guy, and in the story I call him Eduardo. He insisted that I use his real name in the story, and I said, Eduardo, no seas idiota. Don't be an idiot. I'm not using your real name in a story because you live in a one-party country where your family is going to get squashed if this comes out. Because what happened was, after we'd been writing and talking about everything I'd talked to Cubans about together for close to 3 hours, about his life, about how frustrating it was, about my life, and so on. He stops the car. We're out in the middle of the campo, and he turns to me, and he says, I got to tell you something. And I said, what? He says, I'm building a boat. I said, really? He says, yeah. 8 friends of mine and I are building a boat, and within about a month, we're out of here. Yeah, we're breaking the law. We're not getting an exit visa. We're not applying for any of the permissions you're supposed to apply for. I learned this over the course of the next hour and a half. We're going to row because we can't make noise because that would cause them to catch us. If we get caught, we're going to go to jail. We don't know what will happen, our families, but we're out of here. We're going to Florida. We're going to get jobs. We're going to send money back to our families. So this begins a long friendship between me and this guy that I call Eduardo, because Eduardo was only a few years older than my son, who's 30. And I started to really worry for him. I get a little involved with people, obviously, that I'm talking to. And I clearly wanted to follow his tail, but there was also a part of me that wanted him not to go. And so I would start bringing him all the counter arguments of the people who were really loyal to Cuba and saying, no, things are changing, and we're going to make a new society out of this that will have all the great virtues of Cuba and the Proyecto Socialista and the revolution, but will also have some of the freedoms of the United States and societies that we admire without having their terrible individual avariciousness and so on. And he would say, pfft, and he would swear royally in Cuban Spanish. And he would say, they've been telling me that since I was 2 years old. And it was nonsense then. That wasn't the word he used. And it's nonsense now. I don't buy it for a minute. I'm out of here. And so following his tail and kind of bouncing his story off people as I wandered through Cuba became the narrative thread for me while I was there, and indeed became the narrative thread for my piece, because wherever I was, when I really started mixing it up with people and talking about what was working in Cuba, what was not working in Cuba, what they wanted out of the future, what frustrated them, what made them proud to be Cubans, I would say, what would you say to my friend who's 35 years old and is buying tuna right now to go into the water at night to get out of here? And I say this in the article, one of the things that really fascinated me and surprised me about the Cuba of 2012 is that I expected to hear what you always hear from pieces 25, 30 years ago. I expected to hear this young man, not a kid, excoriated, called a gusano, which is a worm, which is the great insult that was always heaved at Cubans who abandoned the revolution in the Mariel boat lift and all the times that you've seen Cubans fleeing. So I expected him to be an object of hatred and scorn. No one had that attitude toward him. Everyone, without exception, all the way up to the official Communist Party member, who's a very respected editor of an international socialist magazine, said, I understand why he's doing it, and I hope he finds what he's looking for. I worry for him, and I hope he keeps his eyes open so that he understands that it's not all wonderful and easy when you get to Florida. It's really hard. I hope he's ready for what he's going to hit when he discovers that he doesn't have any health care there. I hope he understands what it will be like to be someone who doesn't speak English and living under some of the rules that exist in the United States. And I hope he thinks seriously about Cuba. But everybody said, if he's going to do it, he should do it. Godspeed. I hope the sharks don't get him. Which really fascinated me and moved me very deeply. I'm really interested in hearing what questions people have. And I also am fascinated by the fact that Carla has told me that she has recently led a trip to Cuba. And so I'm going to stop a little earlier than I might have because I want to hear your impressions of Cuba, and I'm really interested to hear what questions and ideas people in the audience may have as well. I'll just wind up by saying that I would love to go back. I don't know whether I'm persona non grata now because of my article or not. My article, interestingly, I was just told yesterday by a friend of mine who's a reporter in the AP office in Havana that my article is visible online. They have not blocked it, either in English or in Spanish, on the web in Cuba. It is interesting to me that I've heard since the article ran. For those of you who have not read the article, I think it's fair to say that it's neither wholly critical nor wholly complimentary to Cuba. I had a very complicated time there, and I think it's a complicated picture I'm trying to portray. And I have heard from a number of Cubans in this country, or people who have been there a lot, saying, yeah, you got it, this is what it was like. What's really interesting to me is that I have not heard a word from inside Cuba, ni una palabra, not one word, and I am assuming that is not because they hated it. I'm assuming it's because Cubans don't feel comfortable communicating with me about it because they assume that their email and phone calls are possibly, not necessarily, but possibly monitored. But beyond that, I just don't know. I'm really fascinated. And if I went back, I have no idea whether someone would look at my passport and say, not you. Go back to your hotel in Miami, you're not coming through. Or whether it would be okay. And people would say, well, we didn't like half of what you wrote, but the other half was okay. I don't know, and I'm really interested to hear. Carla.
Well, thank you very much, Cynthia. full disclosure, I did lead a trip to Cuba, and it was about 3 weeks ago with a group from the World Affairs Council. It was only 7 days, and it was a legal trip that was sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department, so we saw what they wanted us to see. We did see a lot of really interesting things and met a lot of really interesting people. And I read your story before we went, and then I just looked at it again now that I've come back. And I have to say that much of what you wrote about resonates quite clearly based on the little bit of exposure that we had in the 7 days that we were there. Now, I can think of a lot of questions, but I think I want to start with something you alluded to, and I think something that is particularly interesting at this point. It does seem that many people look at the U.S. Cuba relationship in black and white. For Cubans, the U.S. embargo needs to be lifted. And if you ask the average person on the street, the first thing they say is, well, the embargo needs to be lifted, and if the embargo is lifted, all good things will come. And on the American side, Americans say, well, Fidel has to die, and until he dies, nothing is going to change. So I think the question that I want to start with, and there are a couple of follow-ons to this, is what will it take for the relationship to change in your view, and how simplistic is that assessment on both sides?
Okay, that's a very complicated and important question, and I'll try to attack it in parts. I'll go backwards. Insanely, fantastically simplistic, as everybody knows who knows about Cuba, and as you know as well. Cubans, I want to digress a little bit and then come back to this question, because those of you who go on the people-to-people trips, the legal trips, it's not like Potemkin Village. You're not going and seeing a fake Cuba. When you go and you listen to the gorgeous music and you you visit the schools and you talk to the people who are there and the marvelously educated multilingual Cuban guides who will squire you around, and you wander around Habana Vieja and you look at those beautiful buildings, that's real. That's not like some stage prop that people have put up for you. Here's what you're not seeing. You're not going back after work with your guide to talk about the members of the guide's family who have gone to the States or who are really frustrated because the only way that they can get toys for their kids is to make use of the stuff that their brother-in-law stole from his workplace. So that's one thing. Second, you're not wandering out in the streets to talk to the people in the streets. You're talking to persons who have been primed on some level. And the reason that applies to the question you asked about the bloqueo, as they call it in Cuba, that's what they call the embargo, is that Cubans are very cynical about the bloqueo. The embargo, let me just state for the record, my opinion, is insane. It is the most manifestly counterproductive foreign policy, or one of them, matter that we have working. It was meant to overthrow the longest standing single regime in the world. It didn't work, people, okay? So everybody kind of gets that. And all it does, and Cubans understand this because Cubans on every level are extremely sophisticated, both about business and politics. What the Cubans get is that it gives the Cuban government a fantastically handy source of blame for everything that goes wrong. My first visit there, a longtime Cuban friend said to me, a cockroach falls into your coffee cup, they'll blame it on the bloqueo. That's the way it works in Cuba. So everybody gets that if the bloqueo were lifted, a few things would happen. First of all, Cuba would be overrun by American money, which if you're a hardy capitalist who thinks that hardy capitalism is the answer for Cuba, is like, go for it. That's the best way to bring it there, number one. Number two, there is a great array of products that they would be able to buy, electronic, medical, and so on, that it does cause them hardship not to be able to get. Number three, they'd have some access to oil technology that they're not able to get right now. And number four, the government would lose its excuse for everything that goes wrong there, and would really be forced to own up to its own problems. Because remember that there's the rest of the world. We happen to be the closest big economy to Cuba geographically, but they do a tremendous amount of business with the rest of the world, which doesn't have a crazy bloqueo. So the second part is that for reasons that I'm not enough of a Floridian nor a Washingtonian to really be able to explain to you to this day, there is a Cuban lobby that is referred to by everybody in Cuba and almost everybody I know who's interested in Cuba outside Florida as the crazies, who will not let go until, it's not just until Fidel dies. It's until all of them die. It's until both Castro brothers die. And all of them who were the original, now in their late 70s into their 90s, group of the revolutionaries who fought the original revolution, a few of whom are still very much sort of holding to a very outdated view of the world. When they pass, and conversely, when their sworn enemies pass, which is the oldest generation of people, the ones who actually left Cuba and came to Florida from 1959 until about 1965, came in rage, came in sorrow, are intent on getting back what they lost, their mansions, their wealth, their country, their notion of how a country should be run. When both those generations die, there is a fairly large contingent of people about 20 and 30 years younger on both sides who are waiting to have actual conversations. And you'll find these people, interestingly, among the Cuban Americans in Florida as well. The sons of the most diehard anti-Castro Cubans in Florida say, wait, just wait, they'll pass, it'll be over. You lots and lots of stories. There was a very moving piece in the New York Times a few weeks ago by a woman who seemed to be in her 40s or 50s and was afraid finally to tell her father that she was going back to Cuba to meet her relatives. She had somebody lie to him because she was afraid he'd have a heart attack and die because he'd been so she had them lie. She said, tell them I'm on vacation in Barbados. And she went to Cuba. And when she got back, he was actually okay with it. You know, he said, tell me how your aunt is doing. Tell me how so-and-so is doing. And she was surprised that for all of his protestations, he was ready to accept it too. So that's a really long-winded way of saying, yes, it's grossly oversimplistic, but there is no easy out right now. Now, there's one other side thing, and then I'll stop for the next question, which is this terribly unfortunate diplomatic standoff we have right now involving 5 Cubans who were convicted of spying and have been in jail for some years in the United States, in prison. One of them has been released, but he's been denied permission to go home. They're referred to universally in Cuba as los cinco héroes, the 5 heroes, and you see their pictures on billboards all over Cuba. And Alan Gross, the American convicted by the Cubans of spying, who has been in jail now for more than a year. And it is clear to everybody that these two, that much of the reason they gave Alan Gross such a long sentence was that they intended to use him as a bargaining chip to get back at least one, if not all, of the cinco héroes, and that the delegation in Florida is so adamant that it will not allow this to happen either. And this is really unfortunate as far as a lot of people are concerned. Alan Gross, the guy convicted in Florida, is pretty clearly no angel. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he was, in fact, doing counterintelligence work from the Cubans' perspective. It was a legitimate conviction. But they gave him an extremely long sentence, as did the U.S. with these Cubans. And there does not seem to be any motion right now. And that is a real problem because they were making some progress before this standoff occurred.
Okay, now I'm not sure which direction to go in. I think I'm going to stick with the bigger question for the moment, and I might come back to Alan Gross and the Cuban 5. Another question, or a follow-on to the big question, is whether or not there are any practical steps that Cuba can take to encourage the lifting of the embargo. And interestingly, on our trip, it really seemed as if the people that we met felt very warmly towards the United States, towards Americans. They did want the embargo to be lifted, but they also seemed to have genuinely fond feelings towards President Obama, and were hopeful that the Obama administration might take some steps in that direction, even though they realize that there's a great deal of obstacles. But I wonder the extent to which you have the impression, do they see the United States as the primary mover in this? Do they see their own government as being responsible? And are there really any practical steps that people think can be taken on the Cuban side?
I have to answer that in a very qualified way, and it's qualified for a couple of reasons. One of them is that I am part of a long line of American reporters to whom Cuban high officials would not talk. I told you earlier the story of my efforts to get a press pass, my efforts to obtain interviews with people who would be able to answer that question at an official level were treated in the same polite, we're putting you into a large wastebasket right now, even as we speak, kind of manner. So I think your experience of having them act warm and so on toward the Americans is a long-standing one. Cubans, for many, many years, for anybody who's gone there in the last 30 years, have been very warm toward Americans, particularly in the days when they knew that just about any American showing up there was violating American law in order to get to Cuba. By definition, the Americans who come to Cuba now, unlike some of the Spaniards, for example, and some of the Mexicans, the Americans who come to Cuba have come there because they're interested in Cuba, not because they want a beach vacation. There are a lot of places you can go that are more comfortable for a beach vacation. So they know we have money, which is very nice. So they like our interest, they like our intelligence, they like our general level of friendliness, and they like our dollars a lot. And that makes for a very good experience. Now, I really think that I'm not enough of an inner person in diplomatic circles. I really feel like this Alan Gross Cuban 5 thing is a big, big problem right now. And you get intimations of that from proclamations from the Obama administration as well. The Obama administration, as those in this audience I'm sure are aware, loosened tremendously very strong restrictions that had been placed on Cuba, even Cuban family travel, during the Bush years, the George W. Bush years, and made it much easier for one of the great lifelines of the Cuban economy right now, by some measures the great lifeline of the Cuban economy, to be strengthened, which is relatives coming in, sending money on a regular basis. One of the things that we didn't talk about earlier was, with all of these dollars, the two currencies that exist side by side in Cuba, the cheap one that I was referring to is the national peso, peso nacional. The other one, equally legal, it's not like there's a black market currency floating around, is called the convertible peso. And it is convertible from other currencies, including but not limited to the U.S. dollar, the euro, the Mexican peso. It's all very up and up, very legitimate. You can go into any change house or bank in Cuba and say, I would like to change these 100 Canadian dollars or these 100 American dollars or these 100 euros, and I would like to change them for kooks, and they will give you the kooks. Anybody can do it. Cubans can do it. Americans can do it. It's fine. So you've got, the fastest way to start a really fun conversation in Cuba is to say to a Cuban, hey, explain this to me. I've got one currency in one pocket and one currency in the other. What the heck is going on? And the Cuban will laugh uproariously and say, come, my child, sit down next to me and I will explain this crazy economy to you, except that none of us understand it either. And then you're fast friends. The problem with all of this is that where are these Cubans getting this currency with which that they need to, as I said earlier, buy the things that they want, which are being sold to them both by private entrepreneurs and by their own government stores, which are selling things to them in this convertible currency, in which, follow me through this, it takes a little aspirin, it's really hard, they're paying people, as Cubans will tell you all the time, they pay people in the cheap currency and they sell stuff to people in the expensive currency. Okay? Yeah. It's just as, I'm hearing the noises there. That's exactly the same noise a Cuban will give you. And you will say to a Cuban, as you're trying to grasp this the first few days you're there, if you haven't done, you'll go, wait. I can't be understanding this right. They pay you in this one, and then when you go to the store and you want to buy some plates, you're buying the plates in the other one. They'll go, yep, you got it right. You got it right. And those plates that we want to buy, that bottle of beer that I want to buy, costs me a day's wages because I'm getting paid in the cheap money. Okay? So where are they getting the kooks? Well, they're getting the kooks in a couple of ways. And one of the primary ways, which gets right back to why they like Obama, is from their relatives abroad. Because their relatives, anybody who's got a brother, a cousin, whatever, expects that person, once he or she hits the United States, is going to start sending money on a fairly regular basis. The banks make it really easy. There are special lines for the people who are receiving it. So that's number one. They'll come back to visit, another thing that the Obama administration made much easier. And when they come back to visit, they're carrying literally multiple suitcases full of stuff, as well as cash. And the stuff can be sold on the black market. So you'll see the classic scene when you're at Jose Marti Airport, which is the main airport in Havana, is you'll see somebody waiting and waiting, and they're looking in the gate. Is he coming? Is he coming? Is he coming? And then someone will appear in the gate, and there will be this outpour of weeping and crossing themselves and celebration and people falling to their knees and embraces because these are people they haven't seen in 10 or 15 years. And then come the trunks full of stuff. The tires, the boxes of blenders, the clothes, whole suitcases full of shoes. All this is going to be sold on the black market for cooks, which is how the Cubans themselves are getting the money. And then the other way, of course, is pilferage, stealing stuff. There's a whole vocabulary. Cuban Spanish is marvelous, as is any country's Spanish. And in Cuba, the word luchar, which in standard Spanish means to fight, the word luchar has a very special meaning in Cuba. Luchar means to take something from your workplace that you are then going to sell, use, drink, or trade for something else. Where did that thing come from? Pues luchado. You know, and I started watching when I finally learned this. I was with Cuban friends, you know, and I'd watch two guys just walking down the street, like with large pieces of wood, clearly just walked away from a construction site, right, carrying large pieces of wood in the paint, you know, and I'd go, madera luchada, you know, stolen wood, and they'd go, yeah, you're getting it, you know, they were all like, you're learning, honey, you're learning our little American friend, you're starting to learn how it works in Cuba, and that's where also those dollars are coming from. So that was a simple question with a very long answer. Obama made that easier, and that's one of the reasons that they're very warm toward this aspect of policy. But until things really open up, it's not going to give. And I think from the Cuban side, I don't know, honestly. I don't know if I could see them very readily saying, okay, fine, we'll let Alan Gross go. He's a spy, and we hate what he did, and he broke Cuban law, but he's been in prison, he's sick, we're going to let him go, and we expect you to let at least a couple of the heroes out. And the U.S. government, with the Miami people at the helm saying, nope, sorry, you know, you let him go, but your guys were spies and killers and representatives of a murderous, totalitarian, et cetera, we're not letting them go. And then we're back to square one.
Okay, so I think you've answered this question, which is focused on, it says, the dual economy is mind-boggling even to Cubans. So I think you've basically started to answer that question. But I do want to follow on from that, taking someone else's question and then yet another one. This person asked, do you think there'll be a smooth transition when the Castro brothers pass from the scene? And in particular, I would like to focus on something which was a subject during our visit, which was the sense that there's a great deal of demands being placed on the regime right now by Cubans for greater reforms. One of them being the ability to buy and sell homes, to buy and sell cars, to work for kooks instead of for pesos. And you talked about one of the reforms that has been implemented, which is the 181 kinds of jobs that you can now work for yourself. And I'd like to ask you if you might talk a little bit about the different kinds of things that represents. It's taxi driving, owning a home restaurant, barbers.
It's very, very precise. And in fact, if you look at some of the definitions, people will laugh uproariously about. It's very Cuban. It's very Cuban. The whole process was done on one level in a wildly democratic manner that you could never imagine occurring in the United States. They had meetings all over the country. The process went on for a year. Anybody here in this audience who's ever been involved in any kind of a co-op or decision-making by group can imagine how wild this was. These 181 categories, which are published in a book, I had a number of different merchants leaf through this book with me, sort of laughing merrily as they would look at it. There is one category, I wish I had the actual wording for you. It is a form of dance done in the style of somebody whose name I can't remember. That's one category. So you are allowed to be a professional dancer in the style of Senor whoever it was, who was a famous dancer. But you may not be a dancer in another style. There is a category of selling productos artesanales, homemade products, which means that you can sell things that you actually made. That's legal. under your license, and you have to pay taxes on it, but you cannot sell what everybody selling productos artesanales is also selling, which is little kids' Chinese blue jeans that somebody brought in a plastic bag and said, look, I just got these things, I smuggled them in from Ecuador. Do you want to add them to your load? Sure. So a lot of people who have these licenses, I had a long talk one afternoon with a guy who sells party supplies. He's got a whole store that sells kids' party supplies. Cuban piñatas are different from Mexican piñatas, of course, are the things that you hit with a baseball bat and all kinds of goodies come out and they're destroyed at a party. The Cuban tradition, apparently pre-revolutionary as well, is different. You rent the piñata and you don't destroy it. You bring it back afterwards. So they're quite beautiful. And this guy made piñatas. So he had a license to sell party things that he had made. But he had a whole glass case, full of things like metal whistles, clearly gotten from China. And he would just laugh. Paper cups. He was not making the paper cups. And he would say, oh, yeah. And I would say, what happens when the inspectors come and they see that you're not selling productos artesanales? And he would just wave and point to his pocket. He said, hey, they got to eat too. That's how we do it. This also, very Cuban, very anybody. We do this all the time in our society as well, I hasten to add. So, I'm sorry, I lost the original, the cuenta propista question. I got so carried away talking about them. They are very specific, as I said, in their categories of what can be done. And the important thing that I want to get to with the question that you asked, and this is really important for Americans to get, there are, I think, as frustrated as I heard Cubans being all over the country, they don't want this. They don't want what we have. They don't want a society in which part of society makes literally tens of thousands of times more than other parts of society. They don't want a society where healthcare isn't free. They don't want a society where a university education is restricted to people who have the money to pay for it. They truly believe that the revolution gave them a sense that these are not things that only people with money should have. And when you ask them over and over, what do you see as a model for a society? They will look troubled and they will say, we don't know. We're groping. This is a country that is groping to figure out what it wants to be. It doesn't want to be China. It doesn't want to be the U.S. It doesn't want to be Mexico. Some people will talk vaguely about Scandinavia, but they don't really have enough access to information about Scandinavia to know what that means. So they will talk about an economy that is much looser, much more approving in terms of individual work and people being able to realize their own efforts, but also quite highly regulated so that nobody gets to get really, really wealthy at somebody else's expense. That's not okay. So, and when you say, what does socialism mean to you? The universal answer I got to what does socialism mean to you was a giant perplexed shrug, especially from people under 40. They would say, it's a word, it's on walls, I don't know what it means. It's what we have here, except what we have here isn't working. So we don't really know what that means. Nothing to do with what Karl Marx originally wrote way back there in the British Library. So that's part of the reason it's so fascinating to be there. These are 11 million passionate, educated people living 90 miles from the U.S., genuinely trying to figure out what they're going to become.
Okay. I'm going to digress for a moment, but in a direction that you're going, which is about one of the particular than anything else I saw in Cuba. Yeah. I don't know that they saw it that way, but they were allowed to start farming in Havana and growing their own vegetables, and then realized that organic farming was the way to go, and the government had basically given them permission to do it as during the special period, basically because people were starving. But it had evolved into a genuine cooperative in which they were making decisions and making decisions on hiring and firing. And so it was a fascinating visit. And
there's a lot of enthusiasm about, there's two separate but very much overlapping movements that you're talking about there. One is organic farming. which the cynical would suggest in Cuba has taken hold because they can't get any fertilizer and because the national programming of agriculture was such a total disaster there. They really are trying to shift out of a sugar economy. The much less cynical, of course, would tell you that they actually really like organic farming, which is true also. They're still, it must be said, importing, the last statistic I heard was Cuba is still importing 80% of its food. Which is dreadful and a real testament to how badly things went. The second movement, also organic in many places, is urban farming. There's a lot of urban vegetable growing on both in Havana, in and about Havana, and those farmers and groups of farmers are bringing their agricultural products to market. And I will not pretend to have developed any expertise on the way that the agricultural market system works. It, like so much of the Cuban economy, is very erratic. You'll see markets, local markets, that seem to be overflowing with reasonably inexpensive produce that people are buying, obviously very healthful things, lots of green vegetables and stuff. And then you'll see a line of 100 people waiting for potatoes because there's been such a weirdness in the potato market that there are only very few potatoes and they're very expensive. There are tremendous shortages in certain kinds of food, and because the tourist economy is so much a part of Cuba right now, there's tremendous distortion. One of the things I make an observation about in the story is that you can't get fish if you're a regular Cuban because the fish is all going to the restaurants. The tourists get to eat the fish. Fish is a tremendous luxury for Cubans unless you've got a certain door that you can knock on where you've got a fish salesperson for you. So there are a number of delicacies that we get when we go to the groaning buffets that are increasingly a popular part of the tourist facilities in Cuba that are far, far more extravagant than anything any Cuban ever gets in his or her daily diet.
Fascinating. So the other question that I wanted to ask, which is related to, again, to reforms and the pressure that's being put on the Castro to make reforms, and that is the supposed lifting of travel restrictions for Cubans. Mm-hmm. And they've announced that this will take effect next year, but when we asked people, well, what does that actually mean? They said, well, they haven't told us yet.
Right.
So how likely is it?
Well, there's three things at work here. The first is that the president of the National Assembly did announce this fall that as of mid-January next year, there would be an end, a qualified end, very Cuban, to what is called the white card, the tarjeta blanca, which is this exit visa that any Cuban must obtain before leaving the country. We have no comparable document here in the U.S., and it both in practice and in philosophy, makes Cubans crazy. They hate it. So that was a big deal, saying that the tarjeta blanca would end. Now, a couple of important qualifications. Number one, there's a lot of fine print. It's not going to end for people who are deemed necessary to the state, and they will define that any way they want to. So the most vocal dissidents, the famous bloggers, people like Johnny Sanchez, who's the best-known international blogger who is referred to within Cuba by lovers and haters of the Cuban regime alike as the whiner-in-chief. We could spend a whole other talking about Johnny Sanchez. But at any rate, the betting is that she will not get a tarjeta blanca. She will not be allowed to travel. The biggest sports stars, the biggest musical stars, and so on will probably not get tarjeta blancas because they will be described as necessary to the security of the state, and the state argues, we put all this money into training these people, into promoting these people, we can't let them out because they won't come back in. So that's the first thing. The second is that what you will probably hear from a lot of regular Cubans, and I bet you did too when you were there, is, okay, cool, so I can get a tarjeta blanca. Now what? I don't have any money. See reference to dual currency system. I can't get a ticket. I can't travel. In order to get a visa to the U.S., I have to get into a lottery system because there's a limited number of visas that the U.S. will give out. And it's going to cost me over $100 in kooks. The going rate when I was there was $160 in kooks, just to process that. Now, if you're a doctor who makes $30, the equivalent of $30 a month in kooks, think about that.
And the wait is 4 years.
Yeah, and the wait comes and goes, but you have to have a mode of transport, you have to have a place that you're going, you have to have a budget for travel. If you're living on pesos nacionales, you have no budget for travel. So my feeling about the tarjeta blanca lifting is that it is more theoretical and symbolic than it will be real. There will be some increased travel, would be my guess. And the third factor in the suspicion that you heard is that Cubans, by long practice, dating back, I think, probably to their grandparents and great-grandparents before the revolution, are dubious about pronouncements that come down from above, because the government has a history of changing its mind. The government, I mean, part of the reason that the efforts, the opening up of cuentapropismo was met with some uncertainty is that there have been several well-known periods in recent Cuban history when the government said, okay, fine, you can be independent entrepreneurs, you can sell stuff in the streets. And then 2 years later said, oh, no, wait, not fine. That's counter-revolutionary. Everybody has to shut down now. And everybody's got a story about someone that they knew whose business was shut down by a sudden, and this was Fidel. This was Fidel who was given to having grand ideas about the society and then saying, oh, well, no, that was a bad idea. Let's do it differently. So there's a real kind of defensive wariness in Cubans about, yeah, I know that's what they're saying now, but just wait. Let's see what they're saying 6 months from now.
Yeah, that was my impression as well.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure that I get to this question before the time gets too short, because I'd be remiss to not ask it. Please talk about the human rights situation in Cuba, and is it as egregious as we hear from the Florida Cubans?
No, it is not as egregious as we hear from the Florida Cubans. I will say that outright, because nothing that happens in Cuba is as egregious as you hear from the most vehement of the Florida Cubans. In the course of reporting this trip, I spent a week in Florida for the sole purpose of driving around. I mean, I talked to a lot of Miami Cubans who had a wide array of different views about it, many of them nuanced and very thoughtful. And I listened to Radio Mambí, which is the main anti-Castro station, and I couldn't believe that they were talking about the place that I had just been. Let's be very clear. Cuba is not a place with a free press. There is a tremendous amount of self-censorship and direct censorship. It is a place where everybody understands that if you shout too loudly and make too much fun of the people in charge, many bad consequences will come to you, ranging from you lose your job to you get harassed to you go into jail for a while. You get arrested on some trumped-up charge. Those criticisms, I believe, are utterly accurate. The part that you don't get when you just read about that in terms of human violations is the extraordinarily robust life, for example, of art and satire and music in Cuba, some of which is as vicious and sharp and direct as anything you would find in the United States. Fiction is given tremendous leeway to make fun of the government. Films make tremendous fun of the government. When I started watching 10 years of comic films of Cuba in an effort to pursue this very question, I couldn't believe some of the stuff that I was seeing. Bureaucrats just made wild fun of on stage as well. So it's as these things often are. I want to be very clear. It is not a place where our definition of human rights are treated well in the main. On the other hand, I also come from the school of thought, and I'm, sort of spilling my beans in this neutral forum. I happen to think healthcare is a human right. So you move into that sort of territory as well, and you can get into those kinds of very vibrant arguments with Cubans. There's a great deal more freedom to worship now than there used to be. So that category is well taken care of. Racism remains a problem, although certainly far less than 50 years ago. So I think the short answer is, as with everything in Cuba, it's very complicated. There is merit to the criticisms, but it is not nearly as black and white, I think, as the most vehement of the anti-Castro forces make it out to be.
Fascinating. You managed to touch on 3 different things, all of which I have questions about. So now I have to choose. I think we should talk for a minute about medical care, because I think that the Cuban medical system is often held up as one of the great successes of the Cuban regime. So we did visit a clinic and had a couple of doctors who asked a lot of questions about the quality of basic care, and were generally pretty impressed. But at the same time, doctors, which have been highly valued by the society, are now wildly underpaid compared to people who make artisanal products and sell them to tourists. So, and then this questioner asked specifically about medical technology and access to new technologies because of the embargo. What is the extent to which the Cubans are able to keep their medical technology up to date? So,
okay, that's a lot, and I know we have to wind up pretty quickly. Number one, there is, in theory, to this day, a universal healthcare system in Cuba accessible to anybody, the poorest of the poor, and a system that, as I understand it, having never been inside a hospital, I did not fortunately get very ill while I was in Cuba, although I thought that might be interesting as a reporter. But it is still a place where, in fact, a very poor child from the countryside who needs a heart transplant can get a heart transplant in a very good facility with what I gather are quite modern and good pieces of equipment. At the same time, it is a system where the infrastructure has been so poorly handled and doctors so poorly treated that if your relative just has some kind of a gastric problem and goes to the hospital, you send an army of relations with that person with Lysol and clean sheets and food because the facility will be awful, will be decrepit. The doctors, most of the doctors still, it's not considered okay to bribe directly your doctor, but everybody assumes that you will bring your doctors chickens and bottles of rum and other gifts from the countryside because you know, and this is genuine. It's not like, it's partly bribing your doctor, it's partly not. It's partly you know your doctor's riding a rusty old bicycle to his job at the hospital, and Cubans really value doctors. They don't think that's okay. It's not that they think doctors should be making $1 million a year, but they think a Cuban will tell you over and over again, they talk about the inverted pyramid, how wrong it is that a doctor has to ride a rickety bicycle to work after having put all of those years into study to help people. So, like so much, again, repetitive theme, right? It's very complicated. They love it in principle. They love their physicians. They love the fact that anybody who's smart and works hard can go to medical school and be treated in the system. They are also very sharp-edged and cynical about the care that you actually receive once you're in there because the facilities are such a mess. I cannot give you an informed answer as to how much the embargo really affects the availability of medical care. My gut tells me not very much. That there certainly are things that they would be able to do better, but that much of it has to do with the way the whole system is controlled right now, and they have a long way to go to figure out how they're going to keep that equality of care while at the same time making sure that physicians make a decent wage.
Great, thank you. So there's one other question that I think we'd like to touch on, and that is something that was readily apparent to us on the trip a couple of weeks ago. Our guide would say things to us like, well, you can Google that, and you can look up information about this on the internet, and you can find all of this out. And then we sort of began to realize, well, maybe we can find it out, but to what extent can he find it out, and how does he know about that? So the question is, control of information would seem to be the last great bastion of many dictatorial regimes. And so how much control is there in Cuba over access to the internet? We certainly got the impression that people were getting some access.
Yes. The way it's working right now is there is nothing as heavy-handed as the Chinese unilateral, we're not letting that run, we're shutting that down. The way they have worked it so far in Cuba, what the official line is, we want to give the internet to everybody, and we can't because of, guess what, the bloqueo. Because the lack of American technology means that we can't put together the infrastructure that would bring all of these lovely things out to all the people that we want to do that. Nobody in Cuba believes that, not one person. I heard it from people outside Cuba. There's a large fiber optic project that was supposed to run from Venezuela to Cuba. It was going to be opened with great fanfare in the summer of 2011, or early 2011. A total cone of silence appeared over the Venezuelan fiber optic cable, and no one has ever heard word about it. Strong rumor from people who talk inside Cuba is that there was some kind of a corruption deal went awry. And the image I have, non-technical person, right, is of they got two kinds of cables that didn't actually work with each other, so that somewhere under the seas between Venezuela and Cuba, there's a giant tangle of non-functional mess. At any rate, the Cubans will say, we want to give the internet to all the people, but we can't because of technological reasons. All the Cubans will say that is nonsense. What they're doing is they don't want us to have the internet because they don't want us reading what's on the internet. And the way it works now in Cuba is that in the cities, in Havana, for example, if you happen to be a Cuban who can afford the exorbitant hourly fees at one of the internet cafes or in a hotel, you are technically able to walk in. If you want to pay 10 cooks per hour, think about that in terms of a physician's salary, to get on the internet, you can do it. If you pay lower fees, which you can afford, you are on the Cuban intranet, which allows you access to certain Cuban things, but not conventional Google, not the pages of the dissidents, and not most of what you want to get. So it's a source of tremendous frustration. In the cities in the countryside, I went into places where they just flat out told me in the government-run internet cafes, there would be signs there saying, if you want to use the internet and pay the fees, you have to show a foreign passport. And I would say, well, so what happens when I walk in here with my Cuban friend and my Cuban friend doesn't have a foreign passport? And they would give me this look that I came to know and sort of love and hate in Cuba, which is the look of a person who thinks that the system stinks but works for the system. And she would sort of get this sheepish look on her face, and she would say, "No está autorizado." It's not authorized. You can't do it. Like, please do not ask me to explain this because I cannot, because this is Kafkaesque and I understand it and you understand it. And that would be the end of the conversation. And I would say, "Thank you, señorita. This is stupid." And she would say, "I agree," and I would leave. And that's how they work it. Now, all that said, there are also a number of Cubans who have figured out how to sneak onto foreigners' accounts. They pay foreigners money for the accounts that they can get. So Cubans, like many entrepreneurial peoples around the world, will always find a way around things. The problem is that the system as it is right now, when your guide says to you, you can Google that, the second half of the sentence that he's not saying is, and I can't. And it ticks me off. And this is something they're really going to have to figure out how to come to grips with. Now, the final thing I'll say about that is that in a weird way, although I think this is outrageous, and I would be on the Cuban side if I lived there, but there's a weird way in which I understand the Cubans' position on this. Because as soon as they open up the internet fully, what are they going to get? Sure, they'll get the New York Times and Le Monde and El País and a lot of reading, but what are they also going to get? We all know. Tons of pornography, tons of gambling, and tons of shopping. And that, if you're trying to create a new society, that is not really what you want flooding your new society. But that is what occupies far more than 50% of what's on the internet right now. And they'll get actual lies, not just sort of hypothetical lies. They'll get actual lies from an actual community that actually wants to overthrow their regime and has actively plotted to do that for the last half century. So without defending it, you can sort of understand the logic of a government that says, yeah, we'll talk about free speech, but I'm not letting that thing happen in my country because I think its ultimate effect will be pernicious.
Well, I must apologize to everyone whose question I didn't get a chance to ask, but I also want to thank Cynthia Gorney for really spending a great hour with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.